Snow whispered down from the sky like it had secrets to keep, covering the plains in a hush that dared even the wind to hold its breath. The world had gone pale and still, save for the slow, uneven hoofbeats of a tired gelding moving across frozen dirt. Levi Rourke sat atop the saddle with a slouched posture that suggested he hadn't slept proper in days, though his eyes, sharp, gray, and always scanning, missed little. He hadn't planned to ride this far past his property line, but the roan mare had spooked during the night and bolted clean through the broken pasture fence. With fencing wire scarce and no help but his own 2 hands, losing her would mean more than inconvenience. It'd mean giving up the next season's planting for lack of a plow team. As he reached the edge of the neighbor's spread, a place once farmed but now barely kept, he spotted something strange near the cattle pens. Something slumped low to the ground, unmoving. At first, Levi figured it was just a busted gate or maybe a dog that froze where it laid. But then it shifted. He brought the horse to a halt and dismounted, boots crunching through crusted snow. A breath fogged in front of his mouth as he stepped closer. The figure didn't run, didn't speak, just huddled tighter against the post she was shackled to, as though trying to vanish into the fence itself. She was little more than a girl, though not a child. 19, maybe. Skin the color of churned milk tea, smeared with dirt. Her wrists torn raw, where rusted barbed wire bit through a strip of rope. Her dress was thin muslin, meant for summer. Her hair hung in stiff, matted locks, and she shook not from fear, but from cold so deep it had settled into her bones. She wouldn't look at him. Levi crouched slowly, keeping his voice low, steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." The girl flinched anyway, her shoulders rising like she expected a blow. "Name's Levi," he added, though he figured it meant nothing to her. He reached forward, saw her breath hitch, and paused. "May I?" She didn't nod, didn't speak, but she didn't pull away, either. The rope had frozen against the barbed wire, tangled tight as iron. It had been there for a while. He used his belt knife to cut through the thick knot, fingers numb and bleeding where wires snagged his skin. When it came loose, the girl's arms dropped limp at her sides like they forgot how to move. Still, she didn't run. She didn't speak. Levi took off his coat, old wool-lined, patched at the elbows, and draped it around her narrow shoulders. She stiffened, but when he guided her up, gently, she rose. Her legs faltered, knees buckling, and he caught her under the arms before she fell. That was the first time she looked at him, really looked. Not with gratitude, but with disbelief, like she couldn't quite believe he was real, like she'd seen men before, and none of them had knelt to help. Her lips were cracked. Her eyes, the color of burnt amber, said more than any words could. He lifted her onto the gelding, tucking her knees to one side so she wouldn't have to balance. She barely weighed more than a sack of oats. He mounted behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist to steady her, and turned the horse toward home. They rode through the hush of late afternoon, the air cold enough to bite skin clean through denim. Levi didn't speak again. She didn't ask where they were going. Just before they cleared the edge of the abandoned land, he cast a glance behind him at the rusted fence and the post that still bore dried blood. No man with a soul should chain a girl there, not even a dog. By the time they reached his cabin, half built with lumber he'd milled himself, perched against a cluster of wind-bitten cottonwoods, the last light was fading. Smoke rose from the chimney, faint and blue. Levi helped her down, his movements careful, reverent. He carried her the last few steps to the porch when she couldn't walk further. The boards creaked under their weight. He kicked the door open with a boot heel and stepped inside. Warmth met them like a welcome. Not much, but enough. A fire glowed in the hearth, and the small room smelled of ash and old coffee. Levi laid her down on the cot near the fireplace and fetched a blanket. She stared at the flames, her expression unreadable. "You hungry?" he asked softly. No answer. He moved to the stove and stirred what little stew remained in the pot from the night before: potatoes, onions, the last scrap of salted beef. It was poor food, but hot. He ladled it into a tin bowl and set it beside her. Still, she didn't touch it. Levi didn't push. He went about tending the fire, then poured hot water into a small basin and brought it with a clean rag. He sat beside her, close enough to help, far enough not to crowd. She let him clean her wrists. She winced when the warm water met broken skin, but didn't cry out. Her eyes followed his hands. Her mouth stayed closed. When he was done, he handed her a dry rag and left her to decide whether she'd eat or drink or speak. She did none of those. But she didn't run either. He moved to his own corner, poured himself a small cup of black coffee gone cold, and sipped in silence. The crackle of the fire filled the space between them. Time passed slow as molasses. She stared at the flames like they were a memory, not a present comfort. Her fingers curled around the edge of the blanket, knuckles pale. Then, softly, barely above a whisper, she said, "They said I wasn't worth the water it took to keep me clean. Levi didn't move. They said I'd ruin the soil if they buried me in it." He set down the cup, not because he didn't want to hear it, but because it felt like reverence, like prayer. He waited. She lifted her eyes to his for the second time, the glow of fire catching in them. "I didn't do nothing wrong," she said. "I just didn't scream when my husband died." Levi met her gaze. "What's your name?" "Willa," she said after a pause. "Willa Hart." He nodded once. "You can stay here as long as you like, Willa Hart." She didn't answer that either, but this time, her shoulders sagged like something heavy had finally been set down. Later that night, when Levi rose to check the latch on the barn door, he heard the quiet scrape of the bowl on the floor. She'd eaten. When he returned, she was asleep, curled in the blanket with his coat still wrapped around her shoulders. The firelight painted soft gold across her cheek. He watched her for a moment, not in longing, but in sorrow. Sorrow for the kind of girl who didn't flinch from cold, but still braced for kindness like it might hit harder. Outside, snow kept falling, covering the fence lines, the hoof prints, and the old rusted post behind the neighboring ranch, slowly, gently, erasing the past. Inside, the silence felt different now. Not empty. Waiting. He sat back down by the stove and poured a second cup of cold coffee. His eyes didn't leave the cot. Something had changed. Not loudly, but fully. The morning sun rose like a prayer unanswered, pale and cold and slow to warm the frost-rimmed windows of Levi's cabin. It seeped through the warped glass and spilled across the floorboards, gilding dust and the edge of a blanket that barely moved. Willa had not run. She lay where she had fallen asleep, curled beneath the quilt like a shadow wrapped in silence. Levi noticed the way her breathing had evened, how her hands, bruised and bandaged, no longer clutched at the coat like it might be stolen from her. She slept with one foot outside the blanket, as if never expecting to stay long. That he understood. He didn't speak when he moved through the room. The cast iron pan hissed as he laid in 2 slices of last week's cornbread, reheating them in a bit of lard. He wasn't used to cooking for someone else. Hadn't done it since before the stillborn boy. His wife, God rest her, used to hum while she stirred pots. This house hadn't heard humming in years. By the time the bread's edges crisped golden and steam rose from a chipped enamel mug, Willa stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, as if surfacing from something deeper than sleep. She looked at the cabin first, then at him. Not startled, watchful, like a bird unsure if the cage had vanished or just grown quiet. He nodded toward the table. "Eat." She didn't move. "You're not chained here," he added, voice low. Her jaw clenched, but she stood. She moved slow, still sore from the wire. He watched her slide into the chair nearest the fire, stiff and wary, and take the bread with both hands like she half expected it to vanish. When she bit into it, her eyes fluttered shut for just a moment. "Thank you," she murmured. It struck him harder than it should have. The words weren't warm. They were shaped from disbelief, not gratitude. She wasn't used to saying them. Or maybe she hadn't had reason to in some time. He nodded once and sipped his own coffee. The day passed in quiet repairs. Levi worked on the broken gate that bordered the west field, glancing now and then toward the window to see if she was still there. She was. She stood near the hearth and folded the same rag 3 times. She swept, though the floor had already been swept. She sat, then stood again. Her movements were small, uncertain, like a creature testing the shape of a new cage. When he came in around midday, She'd cleaned the tin cups and set them in a neat line. She turned quickly when he entered, hands behind her back like she expected reprimand. "You don't need to prove anything," he said, hanging his coat. She said nothing. That night, as snow began again, soft, relentless, Levi sat at the table sharpening his blade. Willa sat across from him, watching the motion, the scrape of steel on whetstone. There was something familiar in her gaze, but also distant, like she was trying to remember what peace looked like. "I was married once," she said, not looking at him. "His name was Silas. He had a cough and a crooked back, but he was kind to me. Not like his kin." Levi paused his sharpening. "They didn't like how quiet I was. Thought it meant I was hiding something." Her voice was flat, but her fingers curled against her skirts. "When Silas died, they didn't weep. They said I must have cursed him. Said I was the devil's child, that my silence brought ruin. They locked me in the root cellar the first week. After that, the barn. Then outside." Her breath caught. "Not from crying," she didn't cry. "From remembering. When they said they'd sell me, I thought they meant to another family. Work maybe. Laundry even. But he came with coin and rope. That was all." Levi didn't ask who he was. He didn't need to. He set the knife down gently. "You won't be chained here, Willa." She gave him a look that was part disbelief, part bone-deep fatigue. But she didn't argue. She just rose, moved to the cot, and laid down with her back to him. He sat for a long time after, staring into the knife's reflection, which showed nothing but firelight. The next morning, Cassidy Grieve showed up. She didn't knock so much as call through the door, with a voice that could slice through wood. "Levi Rourke, you in there?" Levi opened the door, just wide enough to step outside. Cassidy blinked up at him with that powdered nose and gloved hands, all ribbons and righteousness. "Saw smoke from your chimney. Figured you hadn't died yet. Thought I'd drop off extra preserves." He didn't thank her. She squinted past him, trying to peer into the cabin. "You've taken in someone, haven't you?" she asked lightly, too lightly. "Sheriff said you rode back yesterday with a girl on your horse. Pretty thing. Dirt on her dress. Looked like she'd been through a storm or worse." "She was chained behind someone's fence," Levi said evenly. "I unchained her." Cassidy's eyebrows rose like sails catching wind. "Well, some might say that's noble. Others might ask what kind of girl ends up in chains to begin with." Levi's jaw tensed. Those people should keep their questions to themselves. Cassidy pursed her lips. "Be careful, Levi. Folks talk. Some stories don't wash clean, no matter how much snow falls." She handed him the jar and turned, her boots crunching off through the frost. He didn't go back inside right away. He stood on the porch, staring at the trees that lined the ridge, thin and skeletal, like they were bracing for more cold. When he stepped back in, Willa was standing near the hearth, eyes wide. She had heard every word. "I should go," she said quietly. "I don't want trouble for you." "You're not trouble." "I'm not wanted either," she replied, voice sharp with something like shame. "I saw how she looked at you." "She can look all she wants," Levi said, taking off his coat. "She doesn't live here. You do." That word, you, hung in the air like smoke from a wet log. Willa stared at him, unsure how to wear it. Later that evening, she found a pair of old boots tucked near the door. Her size. Mended, freshly oiled. She didn't ask where they came from. She just slipped them on and stood in them like someone relearning the ground. She spent the next morning trying to help in the kitchen. Burnt the biscuits. Poured too much salt. Dropped the ladle. But when Levi took the spoon from her hand to show her the proper grip, she didn't flinch. He didn't touch her, not fully. Just steadied the bowl. And in that small space between them, something softened. That night, she set her bowl on the table and said, almost like a question, "You had a wife once?" "I did." "What was her name?" "Ruth." "She die in the snow?" He nodded. "Her and our son. Winter hit hard that year. I wasn't home." Willa said nothing, but her eyes lingered on his face longer than they had before. They sat in silence, the fire dancing between them. Then, in a voice gentler than the snow, she said, "Maybe this house could laugh again. Someday." Levi didn't answer. But he smiled, small, weary, and real. And that was more than enough. By late February, the snow had begun to retreat from the fields and patches, melted by sun that was still more light than warmth. The ground turned soft, muddied, uncertain. And in that same breath, so did Willa's place in the world. She no longer flinched at the sound of boots on the porch. She no longer slept curled up like a secret. But the town had started to whisper, and that was a colder storm than any wind Levi had ever known. It began at the general store. Levi rode in for salt and lamp oil, but he felt it before the door even opened. The pause in conversation, the pivot of eyes. Cassidy Grieve stood near the thread display, pretending to inspect blue cotton. Her voice carried across the plank floor like syrup over glass. Some men'll take in strays, sure. But there's usually a reason a woman gets herself chained to a fence, don't you think? He didn't rise to it. Didn't even look her way. Just paid his coin, loaded the sack onto the gelding, and rode back home. But the words clung to his coat like burrs. He brushed them off at the fence post and still found them hours later, in his thoughts, sharp and persistent. Willa noticed. Of course she did. "You heard something," she said that evening as they shelled beans by lantern light. "Not worth repeating." "Say it anyway." He hesitated. Then, they're wondering what kind of girl gets chained. And what kind of man keeps her. Her hand slowed, then stilled. Her eyes dropped to the bowl. "I knew it'd come. It always does. You've done nothing wrong." "That's not the same thing as being forgiven," she said softly. He wanted to tell her there was nothing to forgive, that she had suffered, not sinned. But Levi had learned long ago that some wounds needed quiet more than comfort. The next morning, she didn't come down for breakfast. He found her in the loft, curled on the hay, staring through the narrow window at the far hills. "They'll ruin you," she said as he approached. "Folks like Cassidy. They'll twist this into something ugly, and you'll wear it like a second skin." "I've worn worse," he replied, crouching beside her. "And I've survived it. But you don't deserve to bleed for me." "I bled the day I found you," he said, holding up his hand, still faintly scarred where the barbed wire had caught him. "That part's already done." She looked at his palm as if it were a page from a holy book. Slowly, she reached out and laid her hand over his. No trembling, no flinching, just touch, warm and real. They stayed like that for a while, saying nothing. Later that week, Sheriff Doyle came riding up the long dirt track, his silhouette sharp against the low afternoon light. Willa saw him first through the window, went still as river ice. Levi stepped onto the porch to meet him. "Got a question for you," the sheriff said, dismounting. "About that girl." Levi folded his arms. "Folks saying she might have had a hand in her husband's death. That she was wild before you took her in." "That's so." "I don't believe it," Doyle added. "But I've got to ask." Levi was quiet a long moment. Then he said, "You were the one who signed off on her transfer. You saw the bill of sale. Was there a crime listed?" "No." "Then we're done here." Doyle looked past him toward the cabin, where a wisp of steam curled from the chimney like a breath held too long. "You know how this town is, Levi. Even when a thing ain't true, it sticks." "Let it stick to me," Levi said. "Not to her." The sheriff nodded once and mounted up. "For what it's worth, I think you're doing right. Just be ready." Right don't mean easy. When he rode off, the hoofbeats echoed longer than they should have. That night, Willa stood outside by the barn, staring at the sky. The stars had begun to emerge, flickering cold and clear. "They'll never let me live here, will they?" she asked. "Maybe not as you were," Levi answered, "but maybe as you are." She turned to him. "And what am I now?" He didn't speak. He just looked at her, the curve of her jaw, the tired grace in her stance, the way frost caught in her lashes. And then he said, still breathing, "That counts for something." She nodded once, as if memorizing the phrase. The next morning, Willa tried to help repair the chicken coop. Her fingers were still weak, but her determination made up for it. She held nails, fetched boards. When Levi's hammer slipped and caught his thumb, she didn't panic. Just took his hand, wrapped it, and kissed his knuckles before she realized she'd done it. She blushed so fiercely she turned away. Levi didn't stop her. He didn't speak on it either. But the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was warm, tentative, like something new had begun growing beneath the cold. It didn't last. Cassidy returned, this time with 2 ranch hands in tow. They came mid-morning, standing just past the gate like wolves with legal excuses. She belongs to the Givens family, Cassidy announced. They've come to reclaim her. She's not a horse, Levi said. She's still theirs by contract, Cassidy snapped, producing a crumpled paper. Unless you think your barn is above the law. Levi didn't move. You want to take her? You do it through the sheriff. You bring papers that haven't been half-scribbled in pencil and coffee-stained. And you tell those cowards behind you to speak for themselves. Cassidy's lip curled. So she's worth fighting over now? No, he said. She's worth protecting. That's different. The 2 men behind her shifted uncomfortably, and one mumbled something about not signing up for this. Cassidy's pride was wounded, but she turned on her heel and left, her boots stabbing the dirt like punctuation marks. Inside the cabin, Willa sat on the edge of the chair, heart racing. You didn't have to do that, she whispered. I know, Levi said. Why did you? He considered the question. Because I remember what it feels like to not be chosen, to be left behind. She stared at him, eyes dark and stormful. I didn't think anyone would ever say that to me. Not and mean it. He stepped closer, slowly, like approaching a frightened colt. I mean it. Her breath hitched, and she reached for his hand again. But this time, she didn't let go. They stood there, palms together, silence thick with things neither had words for yet. Outside, the fence line stood straight, and the wind carried no gossip. Only the low, steady rustle of dry grass starting to wake beneath the snow. A new season was coming, and with it, something Willa had not known in a long time, the stirrings of worth. The fire began with cedar branches Levi had gathered that morning. He stacked them with quiet deliberation beside the fence post where he'd once tied up broken tools. Now the same place Willa stood, barefoot in the thawing earth, her eyes locked on the length of rusted barbed wire coiled in his hands like a snake that had bitten both of them. It had been a long week of silence from town, but silence didn't mean safety. After Cassidy's attempt to reclaim Willa failed, she had turned to louder voices. Levi had spotted Sheriff Doyle 3 times riding the ridge, and the last time, he hadn't come alone. That morning, the knock came like a verdict. Willa was washing the tin cups when Levi opened the door. Sheriff Doyle stood there, weathered and unwilling, flanked by 2 townsfolk who wouldn't meet Levi's eyes. Need to speak with her, Doyle said. You can speak from the porch. Doyle looked down, hat in hand. There's talk, Levi. Real loud now. That Willa killed her husband. That she left him to die and made off with what was left. Levi didn't flinch. I heard the rumors. I've got to bring her in. Just for questions. I'll be fair. She's not leaving with you. Levi, Doyle said quietly, if you stand in the way of the law, you'll be standing alone. Inside, Willa had already stepped toward the door, the drying cloth still in her hand. I'll go, she said, voice calm. Let them ask what they will. Levi turned toward her. You don't owe them anything. I know, she said, but I won't let them keep calling me a ghost in your house. I'm not hiding anymore. The walk into town felt longer than it ever had. Levi rode beside her, but didn't touch her reins. Willa sat upright in the saddle, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes steady. The townspeople gathered like crows at the gallows when they arrived, shifting from foot to foot with nervous curiosity. Cassidy stood near the front of the store, arms folded, lips pursed like she'd already written the ending. She was always strange, she whispered to anyone who'd listen. Never cried at her husband's funeral. Never spoke unless asked. What kind of girl just takes silence like that's enough? Inside the sheriff's office, the questions came, not harshly, but with the slow pressure of suspicion. Where had she been the night Silas died? Why hadn't she fetched the doctor? Why had his kin sold her instead of burying her with him? Willa answered each question clear and plain. He was sick. Fever, lungs. I sat beside him 3 nights. On the 4th, he died before I could fetch help. Why didn't you scream? Because there was no one left to hear me. What about the family? They never wanted me there. They called me bad luck when the baby came still. After Silas died, they locked me out of the house. They said I brought it. I never spoke up because they'd already decided I wasn't worth believing. Doyle didn't write any of it down. He just watched her, like a man who already knew the truth but needed to let it breathe before naming it. Finally, he looked to Levi. You believe her? I saw the wire, Levi said. I saw the fear. But I also saw the fire still in her. I believe her because she never asked me to. Doyle nodded. That's enough for me. But it wasn't enough for the town. By the time they left the office, word had already spread. Willa could feel it in the way people stared, not with fear, but with that awful curiosity meant for caged things. Back at the cabin, she walked straight to the fence post where Levi kept the old tools, the barbed wire, the broken plow chain. Without a word, she reached down and dragged out the length of rusted metal, the same one he had cut from her wrists that first night. What are you doing? Levi asked, stepping closer. Ending it, she said. This fence, this rust, these chains, they don't belong here anymore. He didn't stop her. He only helped gather the rest. They stacked the wire, the splintered post, the stained rope. And then Levi struck the match. The fire caught slowly, blue smoke rising before the flames turned gold. Willa stood close enough to feel the heat, but not so close it singed. The light played across her face, dancing in her eyes. I dreamed of this fire every night in that barn, she said. Not for warmth, for erasing. The crackle of the flames grew louder, eating away at the wood and wire like time undoing pain. And then Cassidy came again. She arrived on a borrowed horse, skirts muddied and breath short, flanked this time by her younger brother and 2 others from town. We're not letting this stand, she said. You lied. You spun some tale about innocence and sorrow, but it's poison. You fooled him, she pointed at Levi, but not the rest of us. You think just because you burned a few chains, it makes you clean. Willa turned, her posture unyielding. I never asked you to believe me. Cassidy sneered. That's because you've been lying so long, you forgot what truth feels like. I buried my husband with my own hands, Willa said, voice firm. While your friends sold me like cattle. I didn't scream, because screaming never stopped fists. I didn't cry, because tears dried up 2 winters ago. But I'm done apologizing for surviving. Cassidy looked shaken, but her voice sharpened. You'll always be what you were. No, Levi said, stepping beside Willa. She'll always be what she is now. And what she is free. Cassidy opened her mouth again, but the men behind her said nothing. One of them, a rancher Levi recognized, tugged at his hat and mumbled, Let's go, Cass. And just like that, they left. Willa didn't move for a long moment. Her shoulders trembled, but not from cold. She turned back to the fire and watched the last of the wire curl black and brittle in the flames. When the fire was only glowing embers, Levi reached into his satchel and pulled something small and strange, a few flattened pieces of chain, bent and shaped into soft curves. He knelt beside the porch, hammered in a short wooden post, and tied the chain to it. It clinked softly in the wind, like a bell, with no voice. What's that for? She asked. A reminder, he said, of where you came from, and where you're not going back to. She knelt beside him, fingertips brushing the chain. It's not ugly anymore. Neither are you, he said. She looked up, startled by the words, but not in protest. Just surprised that they could be spoken and still feel true. She didn't answer him, but she leaned into him, her shoulder against his, and he didn't pull away. That night, the stars came out clean and unclouded, and the sky stretched wide and silver. They sat on the porch together, watching it, quiet but not alone. Inside the cabin, a pot of stew warmed slowly over the fire. The house no longer felt like it was waiting for something to return. Willa didn't dream of chains that night. She dreamt of smoke curling toward the sky and hands that held hers without demand. By morning, the thaw had reached the garden beds. The ground, once frozen solid, had softened. Willa stood in the backyard with a basket of seed packets, Levi beside her with a spade. She knelt and pressed her fingers into the dirt. Still cold, she said. Good things grow slow, he replied. She smiled at that. Not wide, not bright, but full. Maybe the town would still talk. Maybe the shadows of her past would always live just beyond the ridge. But here, on this patch of earth, she had been unchained. Not just from rope, from shame, from silence. She looked at Levi, who was already digging the second row, and said, "This house, it doesn't feel like waiting anymore." He looked up. "What does it feel like?" She thought for a moment, hands deep in the earth. Like something that might laugh again. And as the wind passed over them, rattling the chain on the post like distant music, it almost did. Maybe the world doesn't change all at once. Maybe it begins with one man kneeling, one woman standing, and a fence set on fire until only warmth remains. Some wounds don't heal in silence, but they do bloom in spring. And maybe, just maybe, freedom doesn't come in grand declarations, but in small gardens, quiet hands, and the courage to stay.